So once you have your first layer down, you're probably gonna have to go over it several times. So here's an example of what it will look like after only one layer, and then this is a better example of what happens when you do multiple layers. So I've gone over this maybe 3 times, so it gets darker and darker. So you see really rich shadows and good gradients on both of these. This is an example of something that's achromatic, while this is monochromatic. Down here we have something that's analogous, but this is what it'll look like if you do a complementary color scheme. So ideally you would go over this a couple more times with that same process. So again, that involves using your water and balancing that out with your paint. You're gonna have to do that same process again. So where the highlight is, we wanna brush over that with some water. As you do this, it might start to lift up a little bit of your paint. I'm gonna add that next color or a little bit more color into that water and slowly build. So it's the exact same thing, just doing that again once this is totally dry. And if you don't wait for this to completely dry, it's still possible to do it. It just avoids that problem where the paper is buckling up and folding too much. And it also avoids the problem where it scrubs a little bit too much. So I'm not trying to scrub away my old paint, just trying to add another new layer of color. At the bottom, remember, we want a reflected light, so I'm taking some cleaner water than before and bringing that down without letting that be the darkest area. I think I can push a little darker in the middle here. And blend. So I'm gonna do the same thing over here with my color. So get your analogous colors, your complements, whatever you were planning on using, kind of ready. And for this, I started with yellow at the top and I slowly got to red and then back. So this is where I'm shifting colors. So notice I grab the edge of everything, and this is literally just another layer of that. I want it to be really dark here. If it's not quite blending, then you're gonna have to help it with your paintbrush. Just kind of go in between the areas that aren't blending. Everything should be wet when you do this, or you'll start to get these lines and shapes that look really sharp and like they don't really belong together. The bottom, I want to pick a kind of lighter color. And there you go. So already this starts to look a lot nicer than it did before. I'm going to wait for this area to dry again maybe skip back up to the top. If I wait for that to dry, that might be easier for me, but some people don't need that. So it's up to you and the process that makes it easier. Obviously, drying takes a lot more patience, it takes a little bit longer, but it does end up looking a lot richer and a lot smoother if you give it that time. You also, again, avoid the paper buckling and the water puddling up in certain areas. So the next areas that I want to address are in the background. So when we have our final sample, we want a background, we want the actual ground itself to look slightly different than the paper, and then we want a cast shadow as usual. And so you can have kind of a blurrier cast shadow, or you can have a sharp one. One of the mistakes that I see is that people will put their shadow down, and then when they're putting the ground in, they'll avoid it. But shadows don't really work that way. For example, if you look at this table here, there's like texture all over it, and then when you put a shadow down, you can still see the texture is showing through it. So we don't avoid, when we're adding our table or whatever it's sitting on, like the shadow, but the shadows are going to be transparent. So you can already start to add your cast shadows in like this, and then when you color the actual ground, you have to include, not avoid, the shadow. So the shadow would be a transparent thing on top of whatever your table is. So let's say that my table is red, right? So if I painted this all red but avoided this, it would look really weird. I would have to paint this entire thing red, including the shadow, so it looks like it's transparent. So that's one of the things that we want to be aware of. You can do the shadow first, or you can put it on top of the actual ground. So whichever way works for you. So for this, if you like to, you can use a bigger brush because it is kind of a larger area. You can decide if you want to use the top or if you want to use the bottom. Because I'm going to be doing a shadow on this one, I'm going to do the bottom first, and I'll kind of show you what that process is. So on this one, I will do the shadow after the ground. On this one, I'll show you how to do it if you want to put the shadow in first and then lay the ground in. So with my bottom part over here, I'm going to make a decent puddle. I don't want it to be a very dark ground because I want the shadow to stand out, but I also don't want it to be so light that it looks like the paper. I'm going to go very carefully around the actual sphere that I made. And I'm not avoiding the shadow, but I'm going all the way to it. And the flat brush is really nice for covering large areas at a time. And that's it. So super simple. If you wanted that darker, then you could go over it with another layer. You could just kind of add more color into there. Again, I'm avoiding that actual sphere as best as I can. And this is something you have to wait to do until that's dry, otherwise it's going to blur into there. So this requires a little bit of patience and a little bit of waiting. So that's what happens if you want to do the shadow on top of that, which is pretty easy to do. So here, I'll do my shadow first, and you can decide whether or not you like this process or if you would like to do something else. So pretend I have a shadow that looks like that. So for our complementary, what I like to do is use the very darkest version of a color. So since over here I have red, orange, yellow, red is the darkest out of those, so I'm going to go right under there. And then kind of treat it like a gradient. So start kind of dark and then use the water to help push that out. And I want it to be extra dark there, so just add a little more, wipe off, and help that. So this is a good technique to do dry if you want the shadow to be really sharp. And again, under that sphere is where it would be the darkest. So these are both relatively sharp shadows that I'm adding into there. Now, because I want this to stay sharp and I don't want it to blur a bunch, I'm going to have to leave this alone for a while. So I'm gonna let that dry and I'm gonna move back up here. So initially when I painted down the ground, it was pretty wet, so if I tried to paint anything, it would blur pretty dramatically. Now that it's gotten a little bit of time to dry, not too much, but a little bit, I can make kind of fuzzier shadows as opposed to really, really sharp ones. So this is an example of a very sharp shadow, and this one kind of blurs out at the edges. So that I can do now that I have my water kind of damp on the ground. And I can do that same thing. So under here, I want this to be just super dark. And then we're going to move this along. And if this isn't as blurry as you want it to be, then you can go over that with another layer. Otherwise, you can just take the edges with your paintbrush and with some water, and then just kind of go around and fade those edges out into the ground. So be careful to avoid the ball still. And we'll just keep going over that part. So you see how it doesn't look as sharp as the one below it. So if you're using black, then obviously instead of the blue shadow, you'd have a black one. If you're using like a different color, then that's the color shadow you would have. So a more natural shadow that kind of fades. This one kind of appears very dramatic and very sharp. So at this point you can kind of decide if you want to do the top or if you want to do the bottom. I'm actually going to cheat and do like a whole coating on this one in a little bit. So I'm going to start by making the top a certain color. I don't really care which one. You can use a lot of water for it also. So for that, I'm going to take one of the colors, yellow, orange, red. You can either decide to make it like super dark, or you can decide to make it really light, whatever, so it stands out. I'm gonna do fairly dark red-orange up at the top. Again, I'm gonna take my brush and I'm gonna be super careful going around the actual sphere, which should be completely dry when I do this. If you need to use the small brush instead, then use the small brush so you have more control. Literally whatever will make this look nicer to you. Okay. There we go. And that's not quite standing out as much as I'd like it to, so I might have to go over that in several layers. I'm gonna grab some more paint, kind of drop that down into wherever's wet. As long as I go around the ball itself so that it stands out, should be fine. There's some areas that are gonna blend in, there's some areas that are gonna stand out, and that's totally fine. If you wanna do something interesting in your background, like add texture to it of some kind or do a gradient, then that's also an option. Okay, so honestly, I could keep this area like really light if I wanted to, or I could do the same thing where it's dark. I just need to make sure that the bottom is actually dry, so again, they don't blur into each other. Again, I tend to like to go a little bit darker up at the top, but you can always do the opposite and go lighter or darker. So be careful that you avoid the actual sphere itself, but if you need to switch brushes for that, then you can. Okay. So the last thing I said I was going to do is kind of cheat this one, and I'm actually going to go over it with an entire layer of a color, and that way the ground will get a little bit wet. So we'll get this kind of look that we do here, where the ground looks a certain color. And so what I did for this one is after I'd painted the background, after I'd painted the shadows and the spirit itself, like you see here, I actually went over the whole thing with a wash of yellow. So as even as I could, I took my yellow, kind of like a yellow-green, and then washed that over. So again, that's something you have to do when this is super, super, super dry. Otherwise, you're going to lift this up. I can feel that this is a little damp now, so if I try to paint it while this is still wet, it'll kind of spread that color out instead of giving me a clean one. So I'm gonna go dry this and then come back. All right, so now this is completely dried off. I'm going to go over this with an entire layer, or what's called a wash of color. And so washes, we tend to start fairly light. You can use darker washes or you can use lighter ones, but I tend to start them light, and then you can go over them several times after they've dried in between. So I have a very good amount of paint here. And so I'm gonna start where it's clear, and I'm gonna go over the whole thing, so I'm not gonna avoid anything, just this entire rectangle I'm going to do in this wash. You wanna be kind of fast because it spreads out if it's not dry. Even could have been a little drier. Oops. Oh well. Okay. If there's any areas that kind of move around, you can, do your best to fix them up. But you don't want to move this too much or you'll start to get quite a bit of spreading. Okay, so after this is dry, you can decide if you want to do more, if you'd like to leave it alone, but at least everything looks different than just plain white now. So we have the background, we have the table or whatever it's sitting on, we have a cast shadow, highlight, midtones, core shadow, reflected light, and then the last thing to do is the tape removal, which will be the last step. So please wait for this to completely dry, go over it as many times as you want to, and then we can remove the tape very carefully. So essentially you can go over this with as many layers as you would like to until it looks like a finished product. But when you are done, you are going to take the tape off. Now you're going to have to do this very carefully. So if you folded back the tape, then you're going to have to get rid of it and peel off very carefully. So one of the tricks to masking tape is sometimes if you tape it really, really well, it is just going to like tear up your paper. So to avoid that as best as possible, you want to be kind of slow and you want to lift up at like a 90-degree angle. So if you lift like this more often than not, I see that's when things go wrong. So if you lift kind of slowly and lift upwards, not pulling backwards, then that tends to go better. So just pull that off until it is completely clean. You can always go back in and paint some more. It's just you probably won't have those really nice borders anymore. So be careful with what order you tape things down and remove that tape. Again, as best as you can, lift in a 90 degree. So small, slower increments will be better.